Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for September 7th. I'm beginning a sermon series this morning that is not based on our assigned readings on the lectionary. I'm jumping off of the lectionary for a couple of weeks, although the sermon this week is based on the letter to Philemon, which is in fact the epistle reading for this Sunday. But I've selected a different Old Testament, a different psalm, and a different gospel lesson to really uh, emphasize where I'm going in the sermon. So let's talk about those. The Old Testament reading that I selected was actually one from earlier in our summer, but I didn't think that that it had the attention that it really deserved, and that is from Leviticus. The instructions God gave to the Levites on how worship was to be done in Israel, but not just worship, also how the community was to function. And so in this reading from Leviticus 19:9 to 18, it talks about when you reap your harvest of your fields, don't go to the very edges of the field, or and don't pick up the gleanings, which are when you go back around a second time and pick up the grain you didn't get the first time. And the reason for that is that travelers coming by at the edge of your field have the right to pick some grain if they're hungry to feed themselves. And the gleanings are for the poor. It's kind of like, the way our food banks operate, where they get leftover bread from a grocery store or something, the leftover gleanings from a field, or the leftover fruit hanging on the tree. The poor people were allowed to come collect that. This actually plays a pivotal role in the book of Ruth, which is the story of King David's grandmother and an ancestor of Jesus, that she, having moved back to Judah with her mother-in-law, they were two poor women. Their husbands had died, and they were allowed the gleanings from a benevolent relative named Boaz's field. In fact, he made sure that they got plenty to eat, and so you can check that out if you want in the book of Ruth. But this was according to what the Levites had written. It says, "Leave them for the poor and the foreigner." And then it has some more familiar teachings. Don't swear falsely, but don't by the Lord's name. Don't defraud or rob your neighbor. Don't hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Why? Because that worker might be living paycheck to paycheck, would be day to day, and they wouldn't eat if you held back their wages. Um, don't steal, don't lie, don't deceive each other, don't defraud. All of these things are God's law as to how we are to treat our neighbor. And where this ends up at the end of the passage, of course, is that you should love your neighbor as yourself, which Jesus was asked what the law, if he could summarize the law, and he summarized it in love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and body, love your neighbor as yourself, and also recognize this as an appropriate summary of the law. So these are some specific ways in which we love our neighbor as ourselves. We don't just greedily grab everything that we can squeeze out of our source of income. Instead, we leave it for the poor and for the foreigner. Our psalm for the day, also from earlier in the summer, very short one, but I think concisely states something that I wanted to bring out. That is Psalm 133, which starts out, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brothers to live in unity," or oneness, I think is one of the translations. Um, and it says it's like oil or precious ointment running down your head, running down Aaron's beard. Apparently, Aaron had a beard. You might be grossed out by this, but think about it. A lot of our shampoos are oil based. People who lived in the desert, who didn't get to wash their hair very often, or when Mount St. Helens erupted, I remember getting that ash in my hair, and it became like concrete, and how good it felt to have shampoo to soften it up and wash that out. And that's the feeling that's suggested here when God's people dwell together in unity. Or another image in the third verse is, it's like the dew of Mount Hermon, which is the tallest mountain in Israel, and one that's known, especially on the lee side, as having just immense amounts of dew and dampness, falling on Mount Zion, which is arid, the mountain around Jerusalem. How wonderful to have a rain, we would say, when we've gone a long time and it's just incredibly dry. Again, another word picture for what it's like from God's perspective when we dwell in unity. So then we have another really short passage that I picked for our gospel reading, because we don't really get this reading much in our lectionary, but I think it's incredibly essential. I mean, how do people know who really is a follower of Jesus? Well, it turns out the night he was betrayed, right after Judas had left to go betray him, Jesus tells his disciples, "I'm giving you a new commandment." Now, what was the old commandment? Well, the old commandment was love your neighbor as yourself. What's the new commandment? Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. So you should love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples. Well, how did Jesus love us? Sacrificially, forgiving us no matter what, and paying that debt through his own blood. So that leads us into the letter to Philemon. Who is Philemon? He was a leader of a house church in or around Colossae. So this letter was actually grouped with the letter to the Colossians. Same people, Tychicus and apparently a guy named Onesimus were delivering these letters from Paul. Paul is in prison in Rome, probably the one mentioned in Acts, where for 2 years he was under house arrest, waiting for his case to be tried by the Roman emperor. And he heard about some issues in Colossae, so he wrote the letter to the Colossians. And there was an issue with a person named Philemon. And the issue was this: a slave of his, yes, a slave named Onesimus, whose name is a common slave name. It means useful, has proven himself to be not useful. He actually had stolen from Philemon, which under Roman law gave Philemon the right to execute Onesimus. He'd stolen from him, and then, of course, he ran away, escaped with his life. But he had gone to Rome, and for whatever reason, he had sought out Paul in Rome. Maybe because Paul was kind to him. Maybe he'd just come to the end of his money. We just don't know. But he is taught the true gospel by Paul, and it becomes, Paul says, like a son to him. And then Paul convinces Onesimus that they need to do the right thing. He needs to go back and face the music. He needs to go back to Philemon. So Paul writes this letter to convince Philemon to take back Onesimus, not as a slave, but as a son, as a fellow Christian brother. Not to execute Onesimus, not even to charge him. Paul says, I will pay whatever he owes, if there's anything. And Paul does this counting on Philemon as the head of this house church. And by the way, Philemon means a lover of men. So here's this lover of men. He's got this slave named Useful that's run away and become useless. And Paul actually makes this pun in this letter that now maybe he'll be truly useful to you. And he does it, tries to persuade Philemon, not on the basis of the law. He says, I could order you to do this because I'm an apostle after all, but instead I'm going to appeal to you on the basis of love. And that's the basis of my sermon, which is about loving community. It's the first part of a description that we came up with at Our Savior regarding who we are as a community. So I wanted to focus on that in the first part of this series as our guiding statement that we're focusing on in this season. So I hope this gives you a lot to talk about, a lot to consider, and not only historically, but practically in terms of how we relate to one another. The Lord bless your study.